I feel like to begin this morning, we should play a game that's called, if the story of Joseph was a TV show, what genre would it be? Because as I was thinking through it this week, I was like, action, adventure, crime, family drama, maybe a reality TV show, maybe a soap opera, or a little of all of that. And I know I've said this in front of you before, but I am here to say it again, that we hear these stories so often that they sort of get watered down and just become these, like, I don't know, little stories that you hear in Sunday school. But this story is crazy. It is an incredibly dysfunctional family. And I just want to hold on to the fact that, there's a lot of things here that aren't just, they're not pretty, I guess is what I say. It's not a pretty story, particularly. So to begin, I just want to go through some highlights of this adventure, action, drama, reality, crime show. First of all, as Amy pointed out, that Dad loves Joseph the best. And I just kind of want to say, seriously, Jacob, that's not super cool. My kids think that we have favorites, but I hope it's a joke. We've never actually said. I hope they think it's a joke, because we don't have favorites, Troy or kids. There's no favorites. But Jacob makes it known who his favorite is. When he's younger, Joseph has dreams that he would someday rule over his brothers, and then, which, like, fine, but I also think it's a little strange that he goes out of his way to tell his brothers about the dream, to, like, I don't know, is he provoking? Is he also not cool, in my opinion? So then we get to the point that we all know the best, probably, where the brothers go ahead and sell Joseph as a slave to merchants, which is really an alternative to murder, just to make it a little bit better. And then they go ahead and they lie to their father about it, so just some more family dysfunction. And then through a whole series of events, which Amy sort of got into. P.S. My scripture today was so long, I just picked the end to bring to you. I didn't. So this is your scripture reading through Janice's eyes. So through the series of events that involves him interpreting dreams for Pharaoh, he becomes Pharaoh's second in command, essentially, and gains some authority over Egypt. So he has a really important role at this point. And every good story has a plot twist. So if this was a TV show, this is where we'd all be really excited. The tables are turned when Joseph's brothers have to come to him, the guy who now has control over a food supply during a famine. So now, who's sitting in a seat of power? And I can't blame him for his initial response when his brothers first come. So scripture tells us he recognizes them instantly, but they don't recognize him. And so he plays with them a little bit, and he pretends not to know them, even though he does, and he accuses them of spying, throw them in jail, and then he holds one brother hostage while the others return to their father. So just another day of sibling payback. And I get it. Honestly, it was maybe the most relatable part of this story for me, is just this desire to give someone what they deserve, or what we think they deserve. But at some point, Joseph decides to reveal himself to them, so they do know who he is. And then after their father dies, there is this surge of anxiety, in my opinion, on the brothers' part. Like, Dad's not here to play mediator anymore. What if Joseph still holds a grudge? And they'd rather be certain, this is my opinion too, but I think they'd rather be certain about where they stand. So like they'd rather be certain that they're a servant to Joseph, as opposed to not really knowing how he feels. Like somehow that feels safer, and so they approach him in the scripture we heard read today. And so they come and they basically say two things to Joseph. One is that Dad wants you to forgive us, which doesn't this just sound like something a kid would say? Like, Dad said you should forgive us. And then the second thing is, we will be your servants. Joseph's response, well, first of all, there is a lot of mutual weeping, which I think tells us something about this interaction. So there's weeping, and then Joseph's response is three things. Don't be afraid. Even though you intended to do harm, God intended it for good. And third, I will provide for you. Now we're at the beginning of this theme, which you've heard already, hurting, healing, growing. And thankfully, it is not the part of the preacher to find all three of those themes in every story. But in this particular story, I actually think that we can. Joseph was certainly harmed by his brothers, and we've all heard the phrase that hurt people hurt people. And we see Joseph do that first time the brothers come back. And I think he does some harm in return to his brothers. There's a quote from Brian McLaren. He's an author, speaker, theologian. Anyway, he says, pain that isn't processed is passed on. Pain that isn't transformed is transmitted. By denying our pain, by minimizing it, by doing anything other than actually feeling it, processing it, and transforming it into fuel for love, we increase the likelihood that we will pass it on. But dangerously, he says, like shards of shrapnel. And I think this is what we witness Joseph doing at times throughout this passage. Like when he's taking his hurt out, it has not been transformed or processed, and so he does some hurting back to his brothers. There's also some kind of growth that has to happen in the middle of the story for Joseph and his brothers to end up weeping together at the end. Something had to change. And it seems that there's some sort of healing that takes place at the end, the scripture that we actually heard read today, and closes on that scene. And so Joseph somehow is able to process and transform his pain. And how did he do it? I don't think we know exactly the ins and outs of his process, but I would propose that it somehow ended with forgiveness. To be fair, I have done a lot of reading about the Joseph story in the last few weeks, and there is some disagreement around whether or not people think Joseph forgave his brothers. So, did he or didn't he? It doesn't explicitly say. They asked for it. They said, Dad said you should. And there's no sentence at the end that says, and so Joseph forgave them. But if I was forced to choose on the debate, I would still say he did. To me, his response is full of grace and mercy. And if it looks and smells like forgiveness, I'm going to fall into that camp today as we talk about this. I sometimes get nervous talking about forgiveness that goes beyond God's forgiveness for us. I always like that part a lot. I'm forgiven. You are forgiven. We are all more than our worst moment, thank goodness. But I get nervous talking about forgiveness when it comes to forgiving the harmer or the perpetrator or the offender. Because while it clearly says in Scripture, yes, we are to forgive as God has forgiven us, I always worry that forgiveness becomes a thing that we do that can downplay the harm done, or comes close to saying that, oh, what you did was okay, when it wasn't. Or like maybe it doesn't honor the victim enough. These are the things I worry about. Is Joseph letting his brothers off the hook or dismissing his own victimhood? And so over the past 2 weeks, I went hunting for better explanations. And I will apologize up front. I'm going to quote a lot of people today, primarily because they're smarter than me, but I will give you the heads up and give credit where I'm quoting. So to begin, I want to quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and he says this about forgiveness. He says, in forgiving, people are not being asked to forget. On the contrary, it's important to remember so that we should not let such atrocities happen again. Forgiveness does not mean condoning what has been done. It means taking what happened seriously and not minimizing it, drawing out the sting in the memory that threatens to poison our entire existence. He goes on to say that true reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the pain, the degradation, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse at first. It is a risky undertaking, but in the end, it is worthwhile, because in the end, dealing with the real situation helps us to bring real healing. My second quote is from Nadia Bolz-Weber. She says this about forgiveness. Maybe forgiveness is actually the opposite of saying that what someone has done is okay. Instead, it's saying that it's so not okay that I'm not going to absorb it anymore. I simply won't be tied to it. Holding on to a grudge or a resentment can feel like a big, delicious feast I can return to again and again until I realize that I am the main course. Maybe retaliation or holding on to anger about the harm done to me doesn't actually combat evil. Maybe it feeds it. Because in the end, if we're not careful, we can actually absorb the worst of our enemy and at some level start to become them. So what if forgiveness, rather than being a way to say, it's okay, is actually a way of wielding bolt cutters and snapping the chains that link us? What if it's saying, what you did was so not okay that I refuse to be connected to it anymore? Forgiveness is about being a freedom fighter, and free people are dangerous people. Free people aren't controlled by the past. Free people laugh more than others. Free people see beauty where others do not. Free people are not easily offended. Free people are unafraid to speak the truth. Free people are not chained to resentments, and that's worth fighting for. End quote. And so I would say forgiveness is not about denial. It's not saying that the wound doesn't hurt or that the pain doesn't matter. It's not the equivalent to letting someone get away with something, get away with harm. I think God is very clear about how God feels about injustice and harm. And forgiveness is not linear or fast. We watch Joseph first mess with his brothers, using scare tactics and shame even, before finally landing where he does with this beautiful reconciliation scene at the end. And so it's a process that takes time. I liken it to a spiral staircase where you go around and around, and when you get to the same spot, you see a similar view, right? Each time you go around the circle, it's like you're still holding on to the pain and the brokenness, and you're like, oh, well, shoot, I've seen that view before, and I thought I was past it, but here we are again. But as you spiral the staircase, you are making movement in a direction, right? But it's not linear. It's not necessarily the shortest distance between 2 points. I read somewhere once that forgiveness is a transformed way of seeing. And this really made me think of Joseph when he says to his brothers, "You meant this for harm, but God intended it for good." Joseph is looking back over his life with a transformed way of seeing. And to be clear, that does not mean that God willed Joseph to be thrown in a pit to die or sold into slavery. This isn't some everything happens for a reason platitude. I would not say that to you. It's more of an acknowledgement that despite all the pain and suffering that he experienced at the hands of his brothers, God was ultimately weaving a story of hope. Barbara Brown Taylor says that Joseph saw a pattern in what was happening in that palace. No one explained it to him, but he could see God's fingerprints all over the place and all over his life. God isn't a puppeteer making things happen, but rather God is more like an artist, like one of those genius sculptors who can make art out of everything. For this kind of artist, nothing is too bent to be used. Not even tragedies, not even bad decisions, not even plain human meanness. And I think that's a transformed way of seeing. There's this old Buddhist story, and it goes like this. There was an old farmer who had worked his crops for many years. One day, his horse ran away. Upon hearing the news, his neighbors came to visit. "Such bad luck," they said to the man sympathetically. "Maybe," the farmer replied. The next morning, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. "How wonderful," the neighbors exclaimed to the farmer. "Maybe," he replied. The following day, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses, was thrown off, and broke his leg. The neighbors again came to offer their sympathy on such misfortune. "Such bad luck," they said to the farmer. "Maybe," he answered. The day after the accident, military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army, but seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbors congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out. "What good fortune," they exclaimed. "Maybe," said the farmer, and that story could go on forever. And maybe that's what it means to see in a transformed way. Just acknowledging that we cannot fully know how events will evolve. While Joseph's brothers planned to do harm, God reckoned it for good. While the brothers act proactively to accomplish one thing, God responds so that it accomplishes something different. God is neither directly or indirectly responsible for the plan to sell Joseph into slavery. God just engages what they did so that ultimately it has a redemptive result rather than a destructive one. God is the voice that meets you in the storm and says, "There's more than what you can see right now." So I'm curious to end, where do you see yourself in the story? Maybe you're in the pit, mistreated and harmed, suffering, brokenhearted. The sides of despair are closing in around you. To you, I say, God is the voice that meets you in the storm and says, "There's more than what you can see right now." Perhaps you identify with the complicated relationships with family, awkward relationships, harmful relationships, or maybe shattered, non-existent relationships. And to you, I say, God is the voice that meets you in the storm and says, "There's more than what you can see right now." Maybe you're somewhere on a spiral staircase, painstakingly headed towards healing, or you hope you are. Getting dizzy every time you come around to that same old view, and yet you know you're making some sort of progress. And to you I say, God is the voice that meets you in the storm and says, "There's more than you can see right now." Maybe today you're ready to wield the bolt cutters, find some freedom. Maybe you're ripe to forgive. Not to forget, not to deny, not to dismiss, but to disconnect from the chain that binds you. And to you I say, God is the voice that meets you in the storm and says, "There's more than you can see right now." Final quote, I promise, from theologian Walter Brueggemann. He says, "When we live according to our fears and our hates, our lives become small and defensive, lacking the deep, joyous generosity of God. However, life with God is much, much larger, shattering our little categories of control, permitting us to say that God's purposes led us well beyond ourselves, to give and to forgive and to create life we would not have imagined." May this be so.